Second presentation is coming from David Makowski from the INRAE France Institute. David is director of research there, specialized in data analysis and meta-analysis and mathematical modeling. He is advising scientists for EFSA and for the French ANSES, the Agency for Food, Environment, Health and Safety. He's joined the CLANS, the Climate Change and Land Use Convergence Institute, which works about risks and linked to land use, and also solutions for ecosystems and agricultural production under pressure. Today, he takes us back in history. David Makowski.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm afraid that my English accent will be much worse than the English accent of Tim, but I'm sorry for that. My talk is about a very specific practice, so no tillage. Why? Because when Claire asked me to make a presentation, I told her, well, I don't work on soil. So we discussed about a possible topic, and well, I remember that I work in a very interesting project on no tillage, and in fact, the history of no tillage is quite fascinating and triggers some questions I think relevant for this audience. So how can I shift that? Yes, this. Yeah. So. Actually, it's quite fascinating to see how many groups of people in the world are against tillage. So you can find groups of people against tillage in almost all continents. Most of them are in America. So, for example, the no-till farmer group or the no-till growers. But you can find people against no-tillage in other continents, for example, in Southern Africa or in Europe, for example, in Switzerland. And actually, some people can be very nasty against tillage. This is a sentence extracted from a report from a service of USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. And I think the sentence is very clear about the opinion of the author about tillage. So why so much hostility? Against a very ancient technique. In fact, the history of tillage is started with agriculture, more or less. So why? So actually, I don't know, but there might be one big reason why a lot of people are against tillage, at least in North America and in South America as well. And to understand it, maybe we should go back to the early 20th century. And in the 20th century, there was a major ecological and humanitarian crisis in the US. In the early 20th century, so we are in the Great Plains. The Great Plains are an area in center South America. We'll show a map a bit later. And the land use was this. It was natural grasslands with a few buffaloes on it. And it was like this during many decades. And something happens around 1910. Farmers settled in the Great Plains, triggered by high prices of food, very good climate conditions. The weather was very wet at this moment. And it was the start of the mechanical tillage system. In fact, it was at this time that the Ford company sold tractors at relatively affordable prices. And of course, so many farmers settled there and they started to destroy the grassland. And they destroy the grassland with mechanical tillage and they grow crops. And it was quite profitable. And the system worked well, at least on an economic point of view, during something like 20 years. And in the 30s, something changed completely. Several droughts impacted this area. And the droughts, we know now that they were related to a La Nina event. So it's a temperature anomaly in the Pacific Ocean. And this anomaly, this type of anomalies induce change in climate in different parts of the world. And in this zone, so the Great Plains, it triggers droughts. And there was a feedback effect because the droughts decrease the biomass production of the cropland. And together with the intensive use of tillage, it destroyed the soil and generated huge dust storms. So it's not small dust storm, it's a huge dust storms, quasi-permanent dust storms, like this. You see pictures here. So basically, people were living in the dust. So it had a very strong impacts on health, both of the livestock, but of the people as well. But what is interesting for us today is that it induced massive soil erosion. So basically, it almost destroyed all the soils in this area. And farming became almost impossible. So you can find many pictures of this area at that time showing farms completely destroyed by the storms. And the scientists made a causal relationship between the use of tillage and the dust storms and the destruction of agriculture. They made this causal relationship in the late 30s, and it was confirmed later by different scientific work. This crisis led to massive migration west, in particular to California. It has a huge impact, social impact in California, because the workers that were farmers in this area, they were in competition with workers in California in the fields. It has huge impact as well on the Mexican migrants, because before this migration, the Mexican migrants worked in the farms. And a few years later, the federal government started to try to do something. And there is this famous sentence, actually it would be a good sentence for your group, huh? A nation that destroys its soil, destroys itself. And it also led to the creation of this service of USDA that later wrote the sentence I've shown you. So how did they solve the problem? So it takes a lot of time to solve the problem, but a big decision was to plant thousands of trees. So the federal government decided to plant thousands of trees in this area. And at the end of the 30s, the La Nina event decreased, rain came again, and together with the planting of trees, it solved partly the problem. Later again, no tillage systems were developed and promoted in this area to avoid soil erosion. This story is was presented in many different works. If you know this famous book, The Grapes of Wrath from John Steinbeck, this book is about this story. It presents the story of several families of farmers living in this area at this moment and trying to survive during this period. And actually, I don't know if you know this movie, Interstellar. It's a very good movie, actually. And it's exactly the same story. It's the story of farmers who live, we don't know exactly where, but it looks to the corn belt. They grow corn. They try to grow corn, but they suffer from huge dust storms, destroying the lands, and they try to migrate. So in the book of Steinbeck, they migrate to California. In the book, in the movie of Interstellar, they try to migrate in another planet. But otherwise, the story are very similar. And actually, I found the picture of the book and the poster of the movie quite similar as well. There are some similarities. And so I don't know if it's the only reason why no tillage has bad reputation, but clearly it plays a key role in America. And now most of the no-till areas in the world are located in America, North and South. What is interesting in this story is that if tillage has bad reputation, no tillage has bad reputation as well. So you have a group of people that are anti-no tillage, so there are no tillage, in fact. And for different reasons, one big reason is the weed control. Why? Because tillage is a mechanical weed control system. It's quite efficient, in fact, to kill weeds without chemicals. So if you don't have tillage, you have to find another way to control the weeds. So a lot of agronomists, several of my colleagues, they developed very fancy cropping system to control weed without tillage and without chemicals. But in practice, if you look at the people really implementing no-tillage system, they use quite often a lot of herbicides. And they use especially a lot of glyphosate. And together with the glyphosate, they use a lot of genetically modified crop. Why? To grow a crop resistant to glyphosate. So in fact, you have a kind of package, no tillage, crop resistant to glyphosate plus glyphosate application. And it's one of the most common cropping system in America. So it has, of course, negative impact on the environment, but it has also a negative impact on weeds, because if you apply a lot of glyphosate during several decades, at the end, you have the emergence of resistance. And that's what is currently happening in America. You have more and more weed resistant to glyphosate. Another reason is that a lot of people say that you have other cropping system with the same benefit as no tillage. In particular, in terms of soil carbon sequestration and impact on biodiversity. And one group of these people are they are promoting organic agriculture. So you remember the nasty sentence from USDA. Here you have a nasty sentence against no tillage. From this organization. Initially, I thought it was a sect, Regeneration International, but it seems not. So what they promote is organic systems. They promote organic systems, and as you can see, they are strongly against the no-till system. So at the end, of course, we have a strong polarization between group of people that are pro-tillage and group of people that are against tillage. And of course, in such situations, scientists can play a very important role, because they can try to collect evidence and evaluate without strong prior view, this evidence in order to see what are the benefits and limitations of the systems. I think this is a key role that can be played by scientists. And here on no-tillage, we are very lucky, because we have plenty of experimental data. If you look at the number of experiments conducted in the world on no-tillage, it's huge. It's thousands of experiments. So these experiments are, for many of them, quite simple. So you have a plot, you divide the plot into subplots. In subplots, you apply tillage. In other subplots, you apply no tillage. And you measure different metrics. So you can measure metrics related to soil erosion, like runoff, sediment concentration, and so on. And then you can compare the soil erosion in no tillage and in tillage and see what are the impacts. You can do the same with other metrics, like, for example, of course, soil carbon sequestration. You have plenty of experiments on that. We have seen some very nice presentation on it during this workshop. What I will consider mainly in the rest of my presentation is experiments related to crop yield, because I work on a lot of crop yield. This is a map showing all the experiments we were able to retrieve on crop yield. So this is not surveys, this corresponds to factorial experiments, okay? So each point corresponds to indicate a number of pairwise comparison, tillage, no tillage on yields. So the size of the circle is proportional to the number of data, and the colors correspond to the crop type. So you see a lot of blue and orange corresponding to maize and wheat. But you also have experiments on many other crops. So it covers basically all the continents, especially in major cropping area. And so in principle, we have a lot of data to evaluate the impact of tillage and no tillage system on crop yield. So if you start looking at single experiments, you are a bit disappointed, because you obtain usually this kind of distribution. So this is an experiment including several sites and several years of yield data. So here you have the yield ratio. When it's positive, it's a gain in no tillage system. When it's lower than 1, it's a loss. So you have about half data higher than 1 and about half lower than 1. So in fact, everything is possible. Difficult to conclude anything. So in such situation, so when I see that, I'm very happy because I'm I like a lot meta-analysis. So I say to when people come with this kind of histogram, I say, well, okay, we can collaborate together. We will do a meta-analysis. And I was very happy to see many of you presenting results of meta-analysis during these few days. So let's do meta-analysis. So for those that who don't remember what is a meta-analysis, it's very simple. You retrieve studies in the literature or from colleagues or from databases in a systematic manner. You extract effect size. So effect size can be a log yield ratio, for example. So the point is effect size, the bar is a confidence interval. You do that for all studies. You obtain a nice picture like this. Each point corresponding to one study. And then what you do is something very simple. Every people understand it. It's a weighted average, okay? And you obtain this red point with the confidence interval. And then you can compare the confidence interval to a reference value. If it's a log ratio, the reference value is 0. If the bar is higher than 0, you have evidence of positive effect. If it's lower than 0, you have evidence of negative effect. And if it crosses 0, you have no significant effect. Simple. So let's take one. So when you look at the literature for meta-analysis on no tillage, actually you find plenty of meta-analysis on no tillage. So maybe it's not necessary to make a new one. So let's look at what was already published. So on soil erosion, you can find meta-analysis on soil tillage. We remember that one of the reasons for developing no tillage system is to reduce soil erosion. Remember the dust bowl story. So you have plenty here. You have more than 100 experiments here collected in this meta-analysis. And if you look at the main figure of this paper, you have this effect size. So I don't know why, but they use a reverse scale. So negative are on the right. So I don't know why, but it's like this. So it means that if you are on the right, you have a significant reduction of soil erosion, okay? So here we see that you have a significant reduction of soil erosion with no tillage, and with reduced tillage, you have also a reduction, but it's not significant. And you have other meta-analysis on the same topic. This is another one, smaller, but I think more recent. And if you put all the results of the meta-analysis on soil erosion on a small table like this, the results are relatively clear. So the number of meta-analysis on soil erosion is not huge. I found 3 here. So you have 2 results showing positive effect. Positive here means soil erosion reduction. And 1 no effect corresponding to reduced tillage, okay, compared to conventional deep tillage. So here it's relatively clear. We have the number between brackets correspond to high quality meta-analysis. It was meta-analysis satisfying standard criteria, quality criteria, but here all are good quality. For yield, unfortunately, it's not that clear. This is one example. This is a very famous meta-analysis published in Nature, 2012, as far as I remember, Pitelco. You see the huge database that they retrieve covering all continents, 610 studies. This is a weighted mean for yield, correspond to something like -5% of yield. When these guys publish their papers, they receive a lot of comments, very negative, saying, well, it's not possible, and so on and so on. So they did they did subgroups corresponding to different cropping systems, but it was always negative. But it's not always negative. So you can find other meta-analysis on crop yields. And this one, for example, they show a positive mean effect size, not significantly different from 0. And in fact, I found 16 meta-analysis on crop yield, reporting several mean effect size. And I try to report the result in the same table as before, but here it is clear that the results are not clear because You have some meta-analysis showing a significantly positive effect, some meta-analysis showing negative effect, and a meta-analysis showing no effect, no significant effect. So it's difficult actually to have a clear view on this topic. Well, the majority is no effect or negative, but you have a few positive effects. So at the end, the meta-analysis did not really completely solve the problem. You also have a strong heterogeneity in the meta-analysis, and this is not that frequent. If you do the same exercise for organic farming, almost all meta-analyses show a yield loss, for example. They are quite consistent. So here we have something different. So why the heterogeneity is so strong? There are several reasons. First, there are several definitions of what is no tillage and what is conventional tillage. In fact, you have a gradient of tillage, and depending what you compare, you can have different results. That's the first reason. The second reason is that no tillage can be combined with other practices. And what is often promoted, for example, by the FAO, is to combine the no tillage with crop residues and rotation. Rotation here means at least 3 different crops. And sometimes people assess conservation agriculture like this. Sometimes they assess no tillage without rotation. Sometimes they assess no tillage without soil cover, and so on. And sometimes they add herbicides to control the weed. And of course, it can have a strong impact on yields, as you know. Another reason is that the effect seems to be quite impacted by climate. If you look at the effect of no tillage on crop yield for different climate zones, you see that in this climate zone, one warm temperature, you have a positive effect. In temperate, you have a negative effect. In subtropical, negative effect. In cool temperate, positive effect, and so on. It seems that it also depends on the irrigation system. So for all these reasons, you have a strong heterogeneity, even in the result of the meta-analysis. So what we did here is to adopt another approach. Instead of computing a mean value, we try to map the effect sizes, tillage, no tillage, at the global scale, using many covariates. So the principle is as follows. So you use a data set, the same as the one used for meta-analysis. But in addition to the effect sizes, you extract the coordinates of the trial. And the coordinates, usually, they are provided by the author. So in almost all papers, you are able to find the coordinates. It means that you have a georeference dataset, a global dataset georeference comparing tillage, no tillage. And from the coordinates, you can access to many additional information. You can access to climate data. You can access to some soil characteristics, for example, soil texture. And in addition to that, you can extract as well the farming practices that were associated to the no tillage practice. Because quite often the authors, they report whether they apply herbicides, for example, whether they use soil cover, whether they use irrigation or not. So at the end, you have a much more interesting data set. You have the effect size, the coordinates, the many climate variables, soil texture, farming practices. In this work, what we extracted in terms of climate is minimum temperature, maximum temperature, precipitation balance, relatively standard climate variables. Then what you do, you put all the data in a machine learning algorithm. And the machine algorithm here was trained to predict whether no tillage will increase or decrease the yield as a function of the climate variables, the soil characteristics, the farming practices. So you can obtain a map from the algorithm. But another advantage is that with this algorithm, once trained to the data, you can, with this algorithm, produce many different maps corresponding to different combination of climate, soil characteristic, and farming practices. So for example, if you want to evaluate the impact of climate change, you can use this algorithm because by modifying the climate input, you can obtain another map corresponding to a different climate. And you can also use the same type of algorithms to evaluate the impact of other farming practices. For example, you can remove or add soil cover, you can remove or add rotation, you can add irrigation, you can add herbicides, and generate new maps to evaluate the impact of these new combinations of cropping practices. So in case of very large heterogeneity, this approach is maybe something interesting, and it can be implemented to deal with other questions. So the process is as follows. You have your data set. So you organize it in terms of inputs and outputs. So the inputs are climate, soil texture, farming practices. The output is gain or loss of yield with tillage. Then you split the data set in two parts. The first part includes here 80% of the data. You train many algorithms. You use some kind of cross-validation procedure to select the most accurate one. And then you test the selected algorithm using the 20% remaining data. And you are able in this way to evaluate its performance using independent data. And then if you find that your algorithm is accurate enough, you can use it using input here to produce maps. But you cannot produce only one map, you can produce many maps as I explained, okay? So with the current package, it's very easy to compare many different types of machine learning algorithms. You have random forest, neural networks, Bayesian techniques, and so on. So you can use different criteria to evaluate them and find the best one. The worst here was a standard generalized linear model. It's a very simple type of model. And the best here was a random forest algorithm. Some example of outputs. So this is the probability of yield gain with no tillage compared to tillage for maize. So we have the same maps for many different crops under current climate conditions. So you have 4 maps. This is conservation agriculture with fertilization and weed control. So the gradient of color corresponds to a probability of gain. So when it's red, it's 0. When it's dark blue, it's close to 1. And here what we see, it's close to 0 actually. Sometimes it's a bit yellow, so it's 0.4. Sometimes it's light blue, it's 0.5, 0.6. So in average, the probability of gain is, so it's 50-50. Yeah. But now, if you remove the soil cover, you obtain the map here at the bottom, and you see that the map becomes much more orange red, showing that in fact you decrease a lot the probability of yield gain if you remove the soil cover. So it's not a good idea to remove the soil cover. Everywhere in the world, the effect is stronger in some part of the world. Yes. Yes. We use the corn map. Everything's corn here. We have other maps for other crop species. Sorry? Soil cover, it's a soil cover with crop residues. It's one of the pillars of conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture is no tillage, soil cover with residues, rotation. If you go right here, so it's conservation agriculture. So here we have the soil cover by residues and we have the rotation, but we remove fertilizer and weed control. And in fact, I don't show the result here, but the big effect is weed control. And clearly it increases the probability of yield loss, in fact. It decreases the probability of yield gain, so it increases the probability of yield loss. And the last map is you remove soil cover by residues and rotation. Okay. So the effect of rotation is present, but it's a bit less strong than the effect of soil cover. So you can produce the same map for future climate. So I take one scenario, standard scenario. So the map looks relatively close, but if you compare, you will see some difference. But to help you, I map the difference directly. So it's the difference of probability of yield gain with no tillage, future versus current. So when it's yellow-red, it means a decrease of the probability of yield gain. When it's blue, it means an increase of the probability of yield gain. And so you see a contrasted result in some part of the world with climate change. The probability of yield gain will be even lower with conservation agriculture or no-tillage system, while in a tropical area in particular, the probability will be higher. Okay? Doesn't mean that you will have a very high probability of yield gain, but it means that it will be higher in the future. So in summary, so the choice between till and no-till system, it's a very sensitive issue due to historical, environmental, and agronomic reasons. So the good news is that we have a lot of trials available. So here I show an analysis on yield, but you could probably do the same analysis on soil organic carbon. I didn't try, but it could be something interesting. You have here a very large heterogeneity because of the diversity of the systems and because of the environmental factors impacting the effect of no-till on yield, in particular the climate factors. If you make a sensitivity analysis, the soil characteristics are less important here than the climate conditions. Overall, I don't think that we can say that there is an advantage of no-till on yields. Only on a very limited part of the world you can find a probability of yield gain higher than 0.5. So I don't think it's an argument to promote this type of system. Anyway, soil cover, if you choose to implement no-till, it's a very good idea to combine no-till with a soil cover with crop residues for crop yield. You will reduce the risk of yield loss in this way. So it means that conservation agriculture is probably a good framework if you want to implement no-till for other reasons, for example, for reducing soil erosion. For most crops, conservation agriculture performs better in continental, dry, and temperate regions than in tropical regions. And under future climate conditions, it seems that the productive performance of conservation agriculture and no-tillage will increase mainly for maize in tropical areas. So that's it. Thank you.